At this point, we've laid out 4 goals of macroeconomic policy, and then we've laid out the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to discuss some of the relationships between these 4 goals. This lecture shifts the focus from goals of macroeconomic policy to tools. The next 3 lectures will focus on fiscal policy, that is, tax and spending policy. The following 3 lectures will focus on monetary policy. That is, how the Federal Reserve conducts monetary policy in a way that affects interest rates and the amount of loans available in the economy. And after that, we'll then turn to discussions of international trade and international finance. The starting point for thinking about federal taxes and spending is that the federal budget is huge. Roughly speaking, the U.S. government spends 20% of U.S. GDP year in, year out, a fifth of total U.S. GDP. According to World Bank estimates, U.S. GDP is about 30% of world GDP. Actually, it's a little bit more than that. So, if you take the 20% of U.S. GDP and multiply it times 30% of world GDP, you get that the U.S. government's annual budget is 6% of world GDP. Or to put it a little differently, the U.S. government spends about 1/16 of world GDP. Now, government all around the world spends large shares of the economy as well. If you include state and local government as well as national government, it's not uncommon to see that countries around the world have government that spends about 1/3 or 1/2, or in some cases even more of their country's GDP. So the sheer size of the U.S. government and the sheer size of government spending around the world commands our attention. This term fiscal policy, that's come up a few times, is defined as government tax and spending policy. The term fiscal comes from an old word, the fisc. The fisc is an old-fashioned word that appears in some dictionaries, but it's seldom in print anymore. The fisc is defined as a nation's treasury, which is the department that handles the inflow of taxes and the outflow of spending. Both of these words, fiscal and fisc, stem from a Latin word fiscus, which can mean treasury, but more descriptively, it sometimes means basket, as in the basket in which inflows of money are gathered and from which outflows of money are distributed. Now, although the U.S. federal budget is huge and it changes every year, some long-term patterns are discernible in its categories and in the levels of spending and taxes. Of course, since the specific numbers change every year, I want to focus on patterns that will hold up over time or that only change very slowly. If you're interested in knowing more about the budget, it's now all up on the web, and it's very easy to find at the Office of Management and Budget website. The main categories of federal spending, which make up about 70% of the total, are much the same over time. The 4 main categories are defense, Social Security, health spending, especially Medicare and Medicaid spending, and interest payments on past borrowing. To put a little flesh on those bones, let me give you a quick summary from the 2005 federal budget. The 2005 total federal spending was approximately $2.5 trillion. Of that total, 19% was defense spending, 21% was Social Security, 22% was health spending, including Medicare, and 7% was interest spending. And that leaves a remaining 31% for everything else in the budget. Now, when I say everything else, what do I mean? Everything else is, agriculture, anti-poverty programs, federal retiree benefits for federal workers, which are actually well over $100 billion, international spending, space and science spending, energy, natural resources, commerce, housing, community development, transportation, federal education and training spending, veterans benefits, law, expenses of running government like salaries and computers. When I think about this overall list of all of federal spending, a couple of things jump out at me. One is that a lot of the really, really hot government arguments are over amounts of money that are really pretty darn small by federal government standards. I think in particular of the argument over the National Endowment for the Arts and whether that should be extended or not. I mean, without getting into the pros and cons, from a federal point of view, it's just not a whole lot of money. or foreign aid, which many people seem to think is some humongous amount of government spending, is actually under $20 billion. And by federal standards, that's less than 1% of the government budget. Defense spending is also obviously big, and it's grown since the terrorist attacks on 9/11, but an enormous share of the federal budget really is aimed at the elderly. Defense spending, even in 2005, is only about 20% of all federal spending, 19%. Whereas if you look at Social Security and Medicare and federal retirees, or more broadly, at spending on the elderly and the health of the elderly, it's an enormous share of the federal budget. It's probably roughly half. Overall, what trends do we see in federal spending over time? Well, to think about these long-term trends, I'm going to again do them as a percentage of GDP to sort of help make clear what the patterns are relative to the size of the overall economy in each year. Now, despite what many people think, federal spending as a share of GDP doesn't really show any upward trend in recent decades. If you go back to about 1960, federal spending has tended to range from about 19% of GDP up to 22% of GDP. It's a little higher than that during Ronald Reagan's military buildup in the mid-1980s. It's a little bit lower than that in the early 1960s, but that's roughly where it is. In the early 1990s, government spending was about 21 or 22% of GDP. It declined a little bit under Bill Clinton's presidency, so spending was kind of at the low end of the normal range when George W. Bush entered office in 2000. After Bush's first term, by 2004, federal spending was sort of back in the middle of that 19 to 22% range. So this idea that many people have that overall federal spending is continually skyrocketing out of control, it just isn't true. As a share of GDP, federal spending more or less has been the same for about 4 decades now. In fact, if you look within federal spending, you can kind of see why this is happening. The category of defense spending as a share of GDP has dropped quite a bit over time. Defense spending was about 10% of GDP in the 1950s. When Eisenhower was talking about the military-industrial complex, 10% of the entire economy was defense spending. Now, the 1960s, through the Vietnam War, that drops to about 7% of GDP. By the 1970s, it's about 5% of GDP. Then it goes up a little bit to about 6.5% of GDP in the mid-1980s. But defense spending then sags steadily through the late 1980s and the 1990s. And right now, it's about 4% of GDP in the mid-2000s. So by historical standards, defense spending has sagged a lot over time. However, Social Security and healthcare spending have been increasing as a share of GDP over time and have basically taken up the slack of that decrease in overall defense spending. And everything else has been sort of redistributed a bit over time, that hasn't changed in big terms. Now, you can see in a way from this sort of discussion why it's so hard to cut federal spending. I mean, there aren't that many big categories. You have to go after defense or Social Security or healthcare. I mean, those are the big ones. Everything else is comparatively minor. What about on the tax side? Well, federal taxes are, of course, highly complex, but again, you can look for some common patterns and some common ways of looking at the tax code over time. And again, I'm going to try and focus on percentages and shares that will be the same over time, not the dollar amounts that change every year. The main categories of federal taxes, which make up 95% of the total, are individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare, and the excise taxes, the federal taxes on gasoline and cigarettes and alcohol. Again, let me give you some actual concrete numbers here. These, again, are for fiscal year 2005. In that year, the federal government collected in taxes in total about $2.05 trillion. Now, of that, about 43% was individual income taxes, 11% was corporate taxes, 38% was what they call social insurance taxes, and those are the payroll taxes that you pay for Social Security and Medicare. About 4% was the excise taxes, that's the taxes on gasoline and alcohol and cigarettes at the federal level. About 1% was the estate and gift tax that are paid, when people die or when they pass money to the next generation. And about the less 3% were some little things like customs duties and fees and miscellaneous little things the federal government gets. Now, again, when I look at that list, here's some couple things that jump out at me, some points for you to think about. Many people, when they think about the federal government's income, they tend to think that individual income taxes are the main tax. And it's true that that's the single biggest tax, but individual income taxes are actually less than half of all federal revenue, 43% or something like that. The payroll taxes for Social Security and Medicare actually raise just about as much money as the personal income tax. And the payroll taxes raise far more money than other federal taxes. In fact, since income taxes tend to be paid more by people who have a lot of wealth, whereas everyone who works pays the Social Security taxes and the Medicare taxes, it's actually true that more than half of the households in the country pay more in payroll taxes than they do in income taxes. So when you think about who pays which taxes, most people are bearing a higher tax burden under the payroll taxes than under the income tax. It's also true that some highly controversial taxes, and I'm thinking here of the estate tax, just don't raise a ton of money in the big picture. The estate tax raises about 1% of federal revenue. So, maybe a good idea, maybe a bad idea, but it doesn't substantially change the overall budgetary picture, whether you have an estate tax or you don't at the current level. Moreover, contrary to what many people think, there is not an upward trend in federal tax collections over the last few decades either. If you go back to about 1960, federal taxes have typically collected about 17 to 19% of GDP. Now, it was a little bit lower than that during the 1960s, pretty constant through the 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s. However, in the late 1990s, in the first half of the 2000s, are really an interesting time for federal tax collections. Federal taxes as a share of GDP crept higher and higher in the late 1990s, for reasons we'll discuss in more detail in the next lecture. But by 2000, when Bill Clinton was leaving office, the very end of his presidency, federal taxes were collecting 20.9% of GDP. Now, as a percent of GDP, that was the highest level since the peak of the taxes collected to fight World War II back in 1944. So historically, that level of federal taxes was very high. And from that point of view, it's no big surprise that in 2000, both George W. Bush and Al Gore campaigned with competing plans to cut taxes. Taxes, relatively speaking, were high in the year 2000. However, taxes then fall very sharply, in part because of George Bush's tax cuts that are enacted in 2001 and the follow-up tax cuts, and in part because a recession hits in 2001, and that means the economy is sort of generating fewer taxes. By 2003, just 3 years later, federal taxes were at 16.4% of GDP. And that's the lowest level for federal taxes since back in the 1950s. So, just sort of to sum up this big swing, federal taxes as a share of GDP went from a historical high, a post-World War II high in 2000, to a post-1960 low in just 3 years. Federal taxes dropped by 4.5% of GDP in 3 years. And since the country's GDP at that time is roughly $11 trillion, 4.5% of that amount is an astoundingly large decline in tax revenue in a very, very short period of time. Most of that drop is in individual income taxes, but some of the other taxes go down a little bit as well, like the corporate income tax. Now, before putting the spending side and the tax side together to get an overall picture of budget surpluses and budget deficits, let's just go down a couple of side roads, clear up a couple of side issues. People sometimes want to just leave out Social Security from discussions of the federal budget. After all, it's run with a separate trust fund and separate taxes. And so the argument is, let's just leave it out of the picture. But accounting measures like a trust fund do not change the reality that Social Security involves government taxes, which are compelled under pressure of law, and government spending, which is chosen by Congress and voted on. When you pay money to the government under penalty of law if you don't pay it, I call that a tax. When government pays out money, I call it government spending. changing the names doesn't mean you can take it out of the picture. A number of economists might advocate changing Social Security without radical reform of the system. Others might advocate more radical changes. But very, very, very few economists, if any, would say that Social Security should not even be considered as part of the federal budget. I mean, you just can't take $500 billion or so in taxes and spending and sort of say, well, you know, that's not in my left pocket, that's in my right pocket. So it has no impact on anything else because it's over here in this different pocket, this different trust fund. It has to be included in any realistic view of what the federal government is doing. The other side road I want to go down for just a moment is state and local budgets. State and local budgets, if you combine the budgets for state and local government, are roughly 13 or 14% of GDP. Compared, remember, to the roughly 20% of GDP that's federal spending. If you add together federal spending and state and local spending, then total government in the United States spends about 1/3 of GDP. State and local spending, however, is focused on very different things than federal spending. State and local spending is focused mainly on education and to some extent on criminal justice, infrastructure, and some other areas. For example, state and local government spent more than $600 billion on education in 2004. So that $600 billion is considerably bigger than the federal defense budget. It's also considerably bigger than Social Security spending that year. So these governments, although they're spending it in many different places at a smaller level, are controlling really substantial amounts of money. The U.S. system of government, after all, gives substantial power and responsibility to state government in many areas. The theory is that local and state services like roads or schools or education will be more responsive to people who live in those localities if they're primarily funded and if the spending is controlled at the state and local level. There's also an argument that people should be able to choose for themselves, at least to some extent, what sort of state they want to live in. If you want a state with relatively low taxes and low levels of public services, fine, choose one. If not, choose a state with high levels of taxes and high levels of public services, and that's fine, you can choose that too. These sorts of differences can persist for a long time. My home state of Minnesota, for example, is a high-tax, high-service state. It sits right next door to North and South Dakota, which are low-tax and comparatively low-service states. There's no problem having those two states side by side. People can choose which one they want. In national politics, this often leads to some peculiar situations, because it's fairly common to hear presidential candidates trying to make a national issue out of what are really state and local responsibilities. So you'll hear a national politician say something like, you know, I believe we need more police officers on the streets, or I believe that, you know, we should really fix K through 12 education, or I really think we need to fix traffic congestion and urban sprawl. Frankly, my own reaction to promises and arguments like that is that if you're a politician and your real interest is fixing schools or fixing transportation or fixing law enforcement, then run for governor of your state. I mean, that's the level where those decisions get made. Show how your ideas work. If you want to run for president, then let someone whose main priorities involve federal tax and spending issues or foreign policy, because those are the issues that happen at the federal level. Now, in these lectures, as they go on, I'm going to stay away from state and local budgets in sort of the macroeconomics discussion, because these budgets are constrained to be balanced by state law. That is, in general, at state and local level, taxes need to be equal to spending. There's some wiggle room there in terms of issuing state bonds, being able to borrow in that way, but it's not an infinite amount of wiggle room. The federal government, by comparison, is not constrained in that way. It can borrow a lot of money. And so from a macroeconomic point of view, that's where I want to focus attention. Now, in any given year, taxes don't need to match spending at the federal level. As a result, the federal government can have a budget deficit or a budget surplus. If the government spends more than it gets in taxes, there's a deficit. If the government taxes more than it spends, it has a surplus. What's the pattern of deficits and surpluses the U.S. government has had in the last half century or so? Well, in the 1960s, The U.S. government ran mainly deficits, but they were typically quite small, often around 1% of GDP or less. 1969 is one lonely year of budget surplus in the 1960s. In the 1970s, there are budget deficits every year, and those deficits start to look a little bit bigger, like 3 and 4% of GDP. In the 1980s, there are deficits every year, and the deficits get bigger still. They exceed 5% of GDP for several years in the mid-1980s. But in the mid-1990s, all of a sudden deficits start declining. And shockingly, to me at least, from 1998 to 2001, the federal government actually ran budget surpluses. And then the deficits started again. By the mid-2000s, they were typically in the range of 3 to 4% of GDP. So that's roughly the same size as they were in the 1970s. Looking at the deficits as a share of GDP, the deficits of the mid-2000s were not quite as big as the mid-1980s or the early 1990s, but roughly the size of the ones that were common in the 1970s. Now, why did budget surpluses arrive suddenly in 1998, and why did they go away? What happened to our budget surpluses? Well, asking about the causes of budget deficits and budget surpluses is a little tricky because people tend to inflict their own policy choices on as the explanation. Like you say, well, why are deficits too big? Well, it's because we spend too much or because we tax too little. So that tells you your agenda, but it doesn't necessarily tell you a reason that's defensible in some deeper way. My way of trying to talk about the reasons why we went into surplus and into deficit is to sort of look at how the patterns of taxes and spending differed from the common historical patterns. And I'm going to say that those differences in historical patterns explain the swings we saw. So from that point of view, this is mainly a story about the path of taxes. Remember, federal spending through the second half of the 1990s was more or less in its normal range, although somewhat at the low end of that range. And then it bumps up a little bit in the early 2000s. But spending doesn't jump to way high or way low compared to its historical levels. But remember that in the late 1990s, federal taxes take off and they reach a post-World War II high. And that's the time we get the budget surpluses. Then in the early 2000s, taxes sink dramatically and fall to a post-1960 low. And that's the drop in taxes that really produced most of the budget deficits that we see. Now, this still leaves open the question, of course, why did taxes go up so fast in the late 1990s? Why did they fall so fast in the early 2000s? Part of it was the legislation. Part of it was the tax cuts that passed in 2001. Part of it was the economy. And I'll talk more about the interrelationship between the federal budget and swings in the economy and swings in taxes that are collected in the next lecture. What I want to focus on here is what does the government do when the government spends more than it taxes? When the government spends more than it taxes, it needs to get the money someplace. So where does the money come from? Well, the federal government borrows the money, and it borrows it in the form of government bonds. A bond, as you may remember from earlier lectures on personal and corporate finance, is how firms and governments borrow. They essentially issue an instrument with a certain face value. They promise to repay interest over time. And they promise to repay in the future. So that process of being there and being able to repay in the future is how the government is going to borrow its $500 billion a year, issue $500 billion in bonds. Now, this fiscal policy of taxing and spending can be related to each of the 4 macroeconomic goals that we talked about before. Now, I should specify here that individual federal tax decisions, all the different tax provisions that are out there, all the different spending decisions and program decisions that are out there, all have lots and lots of microeconomic impacts. You can argue that, this tax or that tax is wise or unwise. This program is successful or unsuccessful, or fair or unfair. I'm just going to set all of that aside. I'm not going to discuss here each individual program or each individual tax. Instead, what I want to do is focus on the overall macroeconomics, the overall impact of the federal budget when you look at it from a big macroeconomic point of view. So in terms of that perspective, how does the federal budget affect each of the 4 main goals of macroeconomic policy that we laid out at the beginning? Well, our first goal was economic growth. Government borrowing and saving is part of what we were calling the national savings and investment identity. Remember that that identity talked about all the sources of financial capital in the economy. The sources were domestic saving and funds from abroad, and then the uses of financial capital in the economy. And those uses were firms using the money for domestic investment and the U.S. government borrowing the money because of its large deficits. Now, if the U.S. government is borrowing a lot of money, that's going to affect the funds available for private investment in physical capital, or it at least can affect that. Because if the federal government is the elephant in the bathtub soaking up all of the available financial capital, that means somewhat less money is available for private investment. It could also mean that the government and the economy become more dependent on inflows of foreign capital from abroad, and there could be a large trade deficit. So those sorts of consequences are one way in which fiscal policy clearly affects growth. It's also going to be true that government policies at all levels of government are going to be central to building human capital. After all, the government is intimately involved in providing education throughout the economy. And as we discussed back in the lecture on positive externalities, the government is also intimately involved in providing investments for innovation and for the development of new technology. So in all of those ways, government policies are going to help focus on economic growth in one way or another. If there's more saving in the U.S. economy, more saving and thus lower government deficits, less government borrowing, then there can be more spending on things that have a long-term return, that can help build long-term economic growth. That was our first goal. Second goal. How can fiscal policy be used to address different kinds of unemployment? Well, we talked about two different kinds of unemployment, cyclical unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. With cyclical unemployment, or with the natural rate of unemployment first, redesigning the tax burdens and how they rest on employers, or redesigning the spending programs that help the unemployed might be able to reduce structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is really about redesigning existing government programs and reducing the natural rate of unemployment in that way. Cyclical unemployment is about what happens in recessions. When a recession means there's less demand for goods and services, and as a result, businesses are less willing to hire. In that situation, the appropriate fiscal policy would be to either have the government spend more or have the government tax less. And that would pump up aggregate demand and gradually reduce cyclical unemployment. What about the third goal of reducing inflation? How could fiscal policy be used to hold down inflation? Well, remember that inflation happens when there's a problem of too much money chasing too few goods, when aggregate demand is so high that it's above the potential GDP level of output. And as a result, prices all over the economy are tending to be increased. So in that situation, when prices all over the economy are tending to rise, fiscal policy could be used to reduce aggregate demand. And that could happen either through a policy of spending cuts, which would have less money out there, or tax increases, either one of which would sort of pull dollars out of the economy and thus help prevent inflation from taking off. And our fourth goal was a sustainable balance of trade. How can fiscal policy affect the balance of trade? Well, again, government borrowing and saving is part of the national saving and investment identity. Government borrowing is one of the big things, one of the big demands for financial capital in the U.S. economy. When the government is demanding so much capital, it's demanding 3 or 4% of GDP each year in terms of its borrowing, then that's going to draw in foreign investment funds from other countries. And in that way, there's going to be a link between high government borrowing and this large trade deficit, which means an inflow of funds from everywhere else. Again, the agenda there would seem to be that if there was more national saving in one way or another, perhaps less borrowing by the government and thus getting more national saving, then the U.S. economy could be less reliant on this inflow of capital from abroad. Now, the next lecture is going to focus on fiscal policy in the short term. So that'll focus on the issue of how should the government conduct its fiscal policies, its tax and spending policies, as the economy falls into recession and rebounds into upswings or economic booms. The lecture after that will then look at fiscal policy in the long term and how fiscal policy affects savings, investment, economic growth, and the balance of trade.